We have an amazing panel of filmmakers here from a range of disciplines, which is what makes this conversation so exciting, I think. And the topic of the conversation is something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is collaboration. And it's something that's overlooked, I think, in film. It's something that isn't given the attention that it kind of necessarily deserves when people go about starting to make a film. So it's good that we're having this discussion, and you're very smart for all being here tonight. So just so I can get a sense, who here is an actor? How many people here are actors? Yeah, it's pretty everybody. Writers? Directors? All right. Producers? People come from producers? Okay, so a lot of people with a lot of hats on tonight. So this will be very interesting for everybody. So if you want to make a film, collaboration is really at the heart of every discussion you're going to wind up having during the course of the film, from the beginning to the middle to the end. And I see collaboration as a sort of gravity on the film set, that it either holds a crew together or it rips them apart. And it can really go either way. I'm kind of a science geek, and the way that I see collaboration is like dark matter. Dark matter is like most of the universe, but you can't see it. And I feel that collaboration is kind of that same way. It's constantly around you. It affects everything, but it's hard to necessarily quantify. So tonight we want to demystify what collaboration is with this panel. So I want to go down and have everybody sort of introduce themselves and describe what they do as well, sort of what their discipline is. Go ahead. With me? Sure.
All right, hello. My name is Max Avery Lichtenstein, and I'm actually a film composer. So I'm usually the last person hired on any job, and can muck everything up really well if I'm not careful. But collaboration is sort of the key to adding music into a film. It's all about finding the balance between what you as a composer have learned about affecting the film, what the director is looking for, what the producers are hoping for, what the audience is going to feel, and having a dialogue with the people you're working with is the most important thing. So that's why I was excited to be a part of this panel.
Hi, I'm Patrick Wang. I am a writer-director. A few years ago, I made my first film called In the Family, and I just finished my second film called The Grief of Others. And I'm also a member of SAG-AFTRA.
Hi, I'm Sabine Hoffman. I have been a film editor for over 20 years about. And as an editor, it's so important to connect with the vision of the director and the producer. And it's really finding that common language together that brings the film into its final shape. So I love becoming a part of it early on, and I love collaborating with wonderful directors and producers and writers, and sometimes it's all in the same person, and sometimes it's different people and teams.
Hi, my name is Nick Greene, and I'm a writer-director. I currently write for a TV show, and outside of that, in the process of turning a short film that I made in Bolivia into a feature film, hopefully going back. And I'd sort of say similar things as if we're doing intros to collaboration. Also having collaborated with people who are from different cultures and speak different languages, I think it's something to keep in mind because everybody has a different background. And connecting across that is kind of what filmmaking is all about, and reaching people in your crew as much as an audience.
Hi, my name is Eric Lin. I'm a cinematographer. For me, a lot of the joy in shooting is actually the collaborative process with the director, producer, production designer. I mean, it's not really the end product, it's kind of the journey you're going on. And so for me, it's a really important process. So excited to talk about it.
So I want to do this discussion a little bit from beginning to end, pre-production, production, post-production. So start from the beginning, and that's sort of the intention. I'm sure that the conversation will get all mucked up from there, but we have the best of intentions to stay organized. So I want to start with the idea of finding collaborators. What has that process been like? And this is sort of an open question for the whole panel, in terms of whether you're looking for collaborators or you've been reached out. Where do these people find them? How do you find them? Where are they out there? Do you want to start, Patrick?
Yeah. It's a mixture of both. You know, sometimes you'll put out the question to your peers and ask for recommendations, and then sometimes they'll, sometimes it's a more formal call But I kind of try to make sure there's a mix of different avenues, because you want to, there's people I love working with again, and there's a lot of people I would like to learn something new from and start a new relationship with.
Who do you start with? Like, who's the first person? Who's your sort of chief collaborator that you begin with and then build out?
Right. The order of where you build the team. Yeah, I think for me it starts with the producer. My projects, I'm the writer, so I usually it starts with a script, and then I go to a producer, and then pretty soon the next one after that is the cinematographer, and I usually like to start a conversation with cinematographer about half a year before shooting, and then all the post folks to composer, editor, I like to start with around the same time, a couple months to 6 months before shooting.
And how about when you reach out to the composer? When is that? That's also just before shooting, a few months before.
Yeah, it's a little different. My projects, the last film had 7 music cues, and this new one has 4. But
easy.
Yeah. One is an overture. But actually something I found with composers that's really nice is I find they're the most active in terms of marketing themselves.
We try.
I have been impressed.
I'll be handing out cards at the
I
door.
have been impressed. I get more, mails and initiations of introductions from composers than anyone else.
I think it's probably because it's kind of the one of the things where you can actually sort of show your work, and the filmmakers can frequently actually see what you've done, use it in the temp edit that they're doing. That's tremendously helpful, I think, during the process of editing. And then it just means that if you find the right music from a composer while you're building the picture edit, you can then reach out to that person, and it really can...
Because it's very hard to let go.
Oh, boy.
Music you put into
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So, actually, let me start with you, Nick. How do you start as like a writer-director? How do you start with choosing your people? Do you also look for the producer first, or what's your approach?
I mean, I'm lucky to have 2 sort of quite long-term collaborators who I've known and worked with over the years, so they're kind of my primary port of call. But after that, it's really about like personal introductions, because you can always look at someone's credits, you can look at their work, you can see what they've done, but like how they behave and how you relate to them and the depth of your relationship with them is like actually far more important. Because someone says they produced a film or they shot it even, you don't really know what they did. Sometimes people will talk up or even talk down their influence on a film. So having someone you trust say, this guy or girl is a great person to work with, I think is far more important than any credit or any, cool shot they might have done. So yeah, personal introductions are massive.
And so, Sabine, when somebody approaches you, first of all, how do you get your name out there? So we heard a little bit how composers do it. So how does an editor do it? How does an editor approach getting their name out there to get the work? And then when a filmmaker does approach you, a producer does approach you, what is that conversation like?
Yeah, I would agree with Nick about how important personal relationships are. And once you have a reputation with a producer and director and their various friends, it's very helpful because you have that personal in. The initial call out is very difficult. I just actually was in the process of sending out hundreds of emails to people I have worked with in the past. And it's a matter of chance, and it's often that one moment where you're suddenly at a party and somebody remembers you in the right moment. I did a project last year where a producer I literally worked with 15 years ago put a good word in for me at the right moment, and that's how I got the job. And I'm extremely grateful for that to happen, but it was pure chance, I believe, or her nice memory of that project, So it's really tricky. But I also feel in New York we have a very active indie filmmaking community. So that's a good opportunity to get your intentions out there, to connect with people, to mix with other filmmakers and hear about who have you worked with, what was your experience,
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Eric? I mean, how does it work as a cinematographer in terms of being approached for projects?
Yeah, a lot of it is word of mouth. I mean, past producers that I've shot for, directors, or anybody who've worked on a project, they'll pass my name along to other people. and if people see the work and they respond to it, you know, we'll have conversations. And those, you know, those conversations are always, I mean, it's like dating, right? It's like, do I like you? Am I gonna spend 3 months with you? You know, we're gonna be able to like hang out? And I'm like, you can ask my wife, I'm an awful dater, so the fact that I can do it, anybody can do it. So, you know, trying to figure out if you can have this rapport with a person is very, very tricky, and it takes a few meetings. And I mean, I don't know if anybody in this panel has figured out, but I haven't been able to. One of my projects in going into interviews is trying to find out is this person going to go crazy on set. You know, like the production is such a, you know, pressure cooker, and like people change, and you know, the intensity of what you have to do is so enormous. You know, I'm trying to figure out a way to milk that out in interviews, but I haven't been successful yet. But that's, you know, the more you kind of meet with people, the more you talk to them and you try to get a sense of who they are. But I think it's also important to know who you are as an artist too, and what you need and what you respond to. Like even when I hire, you know, my crew, like I did a project in Oklahoma City last year, and you know, I was the only, we didn't fly out any crew from New York except a Steadicam op, and so I had to find all the local crew. And I'm pretty paranoid, so I call everybody who worked with this, you know, gaffer or this key grip, and like try to find out how did they react in certain situations. But my questions are also based on how I know I like to work, you know. So I know that I need this kind of support, or I need this kind of like personality on set. And so when I'm asking these questions, it's about, you know, finding out, do these people behave this way when I need them to, or are they going to fly off the rail, or, you know, go crazy. So you know, yeah, talking to people who you trust is very, very key. Yeah.
So Patrick, how do you convince people that you're not going to go crazy on set when during those first conversations that when you approach somebody to collaborate?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have. But yeah, those initial calls, it can be very strange, because you are trying. I mean, you can hear how talk about collaboration is very hard. It takes on, in some ways, a very generic theoretical kind of characteristic. And I like to try to root it to something. And I think that's a good way to test to see how people respond. I remember talking to my sound designer. I'd never worked with him before. It was an interview by phone. I couldn't see his face, couldn't see how he was responding. But I asked him just, you know, how do you hear the soundscape for this film? And he went to tell me, you know, well, music is very important. It's a drama. It's this and that. And I told him, you know, well, I actually was thinking of not having a score for this film. And there was a long pause. He's since told me what gestures he was making during that pause. But what I really liked is not how he immediately responded to the question, and not the answer he gave, but how he moves with how things change. And so I guess that's a way that I use to evaluate, kind of not just where are we at in this moment, but what velocity and in the same direction can we change. And I guess people may evaluate me the same way. If they throw something to me, you know, how much can I hear them? How much can we still communicate as human beings? You know, then that may provide some assurance that I won't go bonkers on set.
Yeah, it's very personal, very intimate exchange. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Nick?
And I think, I mean, if we wanted to get sort of specific, the big dividing line has to be, are they collaborating for themselves or are they collaborating for the project? I mean, I think that's kind of the dividing line, because some people will say all the stuff that's for the project, and you'll get you'll believe them. And then when push comes to shove, when a big decision has to be made, they'll do the thing that services themselves and not the project. And like the earlier you can identify the kinds of people who do that through instinct, I think is fundamentally as important as feeling someone out, same thing. Yeah, you have to smell that out, but people will want to do the project if they're a kind of person who likes to collaborate and likes the project. But if they early on start making decisions that, you know, favor their schedule, that favor, you know, their email response time, little things like that, you get signs. But yeah, project or self has to be the dividing line.
I mean, how much in that early process are you presenting your perspective on the material, and how much in that process are you wanting to listen to them, and sort of where do you fit your decision-making process on that?
I mean, I guess everyone probably feels different. I try to be as sort of low-key as possible about how I see a particular aspect, whether it's like sound or visuals, but giving a clear, like, I don't know, like a clear direction, but not filling in all the details. I think if you can give like a place that where you want to go, and then you can look to the collaborators who can say how they want to help you get there. Because I think a lot of the time you don't really know at that point you're sitting down to have that conversation. It's part of the reason you're sitting down with them. If you knew, you wouldn't need them so much. But I sort of kind of often feel and sometimes don't know anything when I'm sitting down with them, and it's a process of working out like how they're going to help you fill in the blanks of your vision. But people have different ways. Some people want to be like really firm, and I think that can be good too. I think if you have a really clear idea, as long as you're open to people supporting that, that can be as effective. So it's different personalities.
Yeah, Sabine?
I guess it also very much depends on the project and if you have collaborated before. I have a couple of directors I've worked with more than once now, and I read the first draft of the script, and I love it to be involved as early and have at least a conversation. Not that I have any decision making on it, but to have a conversation, maybe see a first table reading. Also sometimes immerse myself in the world of the story, read the secondary literature about the time period. For an editor, it's a dream to get really involved as early and as deeply as possible, because our work is obviously to help the vision or to manifest the initial vision, but also things change during the shooting. So it really is to create that space and know as much as possible of what's between the lines. And I even asked my directors if I have a chance to come in beforehand. Also, we come in on different times, but to learn as much as possible about each character and almost method edit, kind of find out what are their intentions, what are their backstories, as you would tell an actor possibly, just so when we get dailies that I can get a sense of what might be there.
Do you discuss how your workflow and how you like to receive dailies and sort of your ideal workflow, and that sort of gets hashed out early on?
Yeah, that's more the technical aspect in terms of how the production is structured and what we're shooting on and what the schedule is. That all gets discussed beforehand, ideally, if you come in beforehand. I've come in on very different times, as early as 3 years before it even started being produced. Wow. By waiting for budget, and as late as it's already actually a negative cut and premiered at a festival, and then we changed our mind and created a new movie. so the range is wide.
So, and Max, what are you looking to hear from a director or producer when they approach you with a project? Like, what for you puts up a flag, or what for you puts up a green light that you're happy about going into this?
Well, again, I do have the benefit of being able to know that the people I'm talking to have at least already sort of perused my previous work and have some interest in heading in the direction I may take them. That's a big help. And then it's really just a question then, I think, of finding those like shared vocabulary moments where when you're talking not necessarily about the technical stuff or any of the methods by which you're going to execute, but just that idea of like, if I'm excited about one thing that a director will say, like, oh, I really wanted to evoke this kind of feel, or I really like it to be. A project I did earlier this year, I was talking to the director and he said, I just want the score to sound kind of like rough and dirty. And to me, that excited me. And so then he was able to see the excitement in my reaction. And I think you start building off of those little moments, and then you feel like, okay, that's somebody who we're sort of on the same creative page. So you look for those moments.
It really is a lot like dating, like finding those, those little sparks of getting along with somebody. Once you start to put the team together, how do you build the sense of unity? So if a director has a cinematographer and then has the sound recorder, starts to get the people, how do you start to develop a sense of unity? I guess this is more a question for director-writer, but also for on the other side, when you're hired for something, how do you feel involved in the process? Where does that, is it like a weekend in the woods with like trust falls and?
I mean, that kind of thing can help. I mean, doing things that it sounds so cheesy, but like kind of working out a way to bond with that person a little bit, not being too, not jumping into your ideas about something too firmly to begin with. feeling someone out. But I think language is a major thing, and being able to communicate a vision to someone, whether you're doing it through images or words or music, you need to find different mediums that can cut through all the stuff between you and the collaborator, and that's going to vary depending on whether that person is a cinematographer or a production designer. You know, you might be talking textures and fabrics with a production designer, and you might be talking sort of feel and mood with a cinematographer. And if you start to go too far and you're talking about like lighting setups with a cinematographer, I think that's where you're getting into the realm of doing their job for them and not really communicating the feel and vision of the story. So yeah, you kind of, I guess, bond through doing things that are fun, but also the sort of the choices you make and how you communicate your vision are part of that bonding experience, and you get excited by stuff, and other stuff doesn't excite you, and you feel that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think, Eric? How does it go for you?
Yeah. I was going to say, yeah, I mean, as artists, we're all very different. Our personalities are very different. But I would say my best collaborative relationships have been with people who utilize the people around them as artists, right? They trust them. They're giving them guidance, like you know, you were saying earlier about the director telling you about the score, right? Like, you want like for me as a cinematographer, I want the director to say, oh, this, you know, I want to evoke this kind of mood. You know, I don't want him to tell me we need this light here and this camera here and this lens. You know, like, obviously, you know, like someone like Dave Fincher already knows what his film is going to be before he steps on set. So, you know, he's not really relying on people around him as artists, you know, to interpret his vision. But for me, the most like kind of collaborative relationships have utilized that. You know, you see directors relying on production designer to bring this to them, you know, the cinematographer to offer this, and then, you know, they're kind of filtering this feedback into kind of what the vision of the film should be. And so, you know, for pre-production is pretty structured. So at least as a cinematographer, you get a sense of kind of what, you know, what kind of collaboration it will be as you work on the shot list, as you go to location scout, and you know, you can kind of, you start to establish that language as you talk about films, you talk about visuals, you know, you talk about what scenes should be. And so for me, like, talking about the work in front of us is a good way to kind of establish that language very early on. But yeah, I mean, I think it's like how clearly they can kind of communicate what they want from you, and also, you know, allow you to, you know, bring more to it.
Yeah. How about you, Patrick? In terms of you know, building the unity and the trust and these kinds of things heading in, how does, do you have any tricks or techniques? Well, or does it just evolve by itself?
I hope they're not tricks, but I think we tried to be regimented about it. You know, when my DP and I started talking about the project, we just had open conference calls that other people could listen into. And what was nice is, you know, at the beginning they're not technical. They're about the scene. And so it's just kind of inviting people to talk and hear about the scene. A couple months out from the shoot, we also did a test shoot. And we tried to find a way to involve as many people as possible, from getting, you know, the makeup designer to come and see, to, you know, there's no production design to show anyone, but there were these specialty props that they had started working on. So, like Nick said, the idea that if this is a group of people who cares about the thing, about the film, about the making, then to have as many of those things in front of us, making the introduction for us, kind of pulling us all in, I think helps.
Yeah.
And in fact, like for me as a composer, sometimes there are projects where you feel a connection, you feel like, okay, I think we're headed in the right direction, we're both on the same page, but it's nice to sort of test the waters a little bit. And so frequently that's another way that you can sort of figure out if it's going to work. You can do a little bit of work, you can sort of, and sometimes it can just be casual. It can, you know, and those are usually the best kinds of relationships where you can just say, look, I'm interested in the project, I like what you seem to be suggesting as for an idea. Let me see if I can help you get there, and if that helps to move things along, great.
Right.
But
yeah, go ahead.
Also, you know, in terms of creating a language and learning as much as possible ahead of time, but then also really creating a safe space to explore. For editing, it's easier because at that point you're not as much fighting against the light. You don't have to deal with 100 people on set. So it's almost a holy space. But I feel it's really important to make that a safe space to explore and a playground where we can have fun with things, where we can. Nobody has to see the result yet. That's a whole nother phase. But that exploration space that brings you as the writer or director or producer back to, okay, what do we have? After the shoot is the big, you know, and now we kind of rethink it. And to open the doors to inspiration and be really open for ideas. Quincy Jones, I think, had the sign at the door of his studio saying, "Leave your ego at the door." I think that can be very helpful.
Yeah.
It's also important to feel out how people deal with disagreement as well, because if something comes up and they have one idea and you have another idea, like how they react to that tells you everything about them. And if they respect the project, they will challenge you on your idea, and it'll become a better idea through some kind of synthesis or whatever you want to call it. But if they are more about themselves, they'll start to just push their ideas, and it'll take the project in a different and perhaps unhealthy kind of direction. But even I know some people who will throw in a little conflict early on in a relationship just to kind of see how people react to that. It's not something I do. I might try and do it, but
please don't do that.
But it just flushes out people's agenda sometimes, you know, and you get a sense of what they're all about, and you know, sometimes that can help speed things up, and you can end a relationship gracefully early on rather than sticking with it. So, yeah,
that's great.
Controlled conflict, at least.
And I love. And I love what you say about fun, that being a key word in this process also. I had one of the films that I did, my cinematographer thought it would be a nice sort of building activity, trust building activity. He's a really physical guy, really strong guy, and he thought he would take everyone out in the crew for morning exercises. Every morning, kind of like boot camp, wake up early in the morning, pull-ups, running, all this kind of stuff. And it would be good team building activity. Although it backfired on the third day when the person who was like uploading all the footage onto the hard drives and sort of our technical specialist, she was doing a pull-up and she tore her rotator cuff and wound up in the hospital. And so we were then minus this person on our crew. So it kind of didn't work out. But the idea was a good idea. We just should have checked with the doctor first before doing the exercises.
Maybe meditation is safer.
Yeah. What's that?
Group meditation is safer.
Meditation safer. So, and also language is a very key idea here. Language is a really important idea. And something that I've noticed myself personally is that I feel like directors in particular have troubles talking to composers. That is a language that doesn't necessarily come naturally to a lot of directors, because directors are usually visual people. They're storytellers, and music works at a whole different level of emotion and abstraction that I think is hard for a lot of directors to necessarily appreciate. I mean, how have directors, you know, that one director who mentioned to you that he wanted a kind of a dirty sound, I mean, that's very interesting. Like, what are other ways, effective ways, that a director or producer sort of talk to you and communicated to you so you know what they want?
Well, I guess there's a variety of approaches. One is if they are familiar with the huge libraries of films that are out there, but not necessarily of the scores themselves, they can still reference and say, you know, I really like, you know, the way this film was working. I really like the way that the music handled this aspect of that character, or those kinds of avenues to get at an idea can help. Reference points can be really useful. I guess it kind of all depends. Some directors do come in with a surprising amount of musical knowledge, I find, and I actually like that just as much as I like working with people who really have no understanding of the mechanisms by which the music is working. The nice thing is interfacing with somebody who's willing to sort of do some experimenting and let you play around a little bit, give you a little bit of freedom at the beginning, and then you can build your own vocabulary. The two of you together, you can say like, all right, so I've sent you, here's a cue for this scene, what do you think? And then you can get some feedback on that. And then based on the feedback that you get, now you have a nugget of information like, okay, this is the way this person hears things. One thing that I always get bit by is certain instrumental choices. If you pick, for example, a Hammond organ, which is like that classic rock organ, you know, it's a great sound. Some people love it and they listen to it and they hear, you know, old classic rock. Some people listen to it and think church. And if you put an organ in a cue, depending on the director, one person is going to love it, the other person is not. And based on the response, if they say, you know, something reminds me, it's too like, I don't know, it's too sort of stiff and it makes me, you know, feel too proper. And then sometimes you have to translate and say like, oh, you know what, maybe it's that organ I put in there. It's too solemn, it's too churchy or something. So you have to look for those opportunities to sort of figure out the vocabulary that your collaborator is using. So.
Yeah. And Eric, how about you? I mean, how do directors communicate to you? Do you watch movies together? Do you talk about cinematographers together?
Yeah, it's. I mean, we talk about everything. Like, I mean, we talk about music. You know, we talk about literature. Yeah, it's kind of like just trying to get in the same kind of aesthetic space and having them understand what your interests are, but also trying to, you know, kind of dig into what their intent is. And I think. I mean, like Sabine said, when I'm talking to the director or like when stuff's going crazy on set and we're trying to find the shot, it's always, you know, what's the scene about? What's this character? What's happening with this character? And sometimes you have to remind the director that that's what's important. It's not about coverage. You know, it's like, well, what's happening in the scene? Let's go back to, you know, the basic. But it's surprising how easy that is to forget on set. You know, you're just like trying to tear through a day. But that's what we're creating. So trying to remember that, but it comes back to kind of what happens in pre-production, where I talk a lot in shot listing. A lot of times I find that directors rewrite a lot in shot listing because you're talking through the script visually and you're talking about transitions and behavior, and you realize some things made sense on page, but maybe not necessarily visually when you're going to translate it. And as you talk through that, you're trying to, you're basically starting to build it, and you're dreaming at that stage. You're trying to find what the film could be, and there's so many possibilities. But then you start to narrow kind of your, the choices as you find kind of the core of the film, what it is. And so that process is really, the pre-production process is really the key to where that is. And hopefully it's you learn a lot about your collaborator as you're exploring it together. I mean, sometimes they have a very firm idea, but sometimes there's a lot of space for interpretation, and they're not quite sure what it is. Yeah.
And Sabine, on like, for instance, Ballad of Jack and Rose, I mean, where did those, like, was that just all your sort of idea about how to cut that movie together, the feel of the editing? I mean, where does that sort of conversation happen? Where does that come from?
Oh, I mean, it starts with Rebecca. It starts early on. Yeah. In that case, because we had done Personal Velocity, which I came on right before shooting, so we didn't have a lot of prep for that. But in Ballad, we talked about the script, and then also we shot Ballad chronologically, and I was on set on that movie. So we shot it in Canada, and I was cutting on location as we were shooting, and there were things that came up in the shoot where we could just quickly take a look, or she called me to set, or then ultimately also what I think why it's always good to have an editor early on is if you realize you're missing transitions, because you can write the most beautiful transitions and then they end up not working out or slightly looks different, or you end up restructuring scenes, or at least you want to have possibility to. So in particular in Ballad, because Ellen is such a poet, we talked about doing a lot of B-roll, and she just went out one day and got the most amazing shots that were super handy throughout the process and helped us later on, because things always change. So
right. So it's good to have everybody on early. Like Patrick, you were saying, it seems like you have a very good approach that you get everybody on early. You don't leave yourself in a position as a writer-director where you're sort of scrambling at the end to kind of like, oh, we got to get somebody for this, we got to get a composer, we got to get an editor after everything's already been done.
Yeah, I'm slow, so I need
Methodical.
to take the time before.
Yeah. So I think as we head into like production, for me the theme of production is exhaustion, physical and emotional and mental exhaustion. Production is hard and it's intense, and I think that we talked about that sort of early on, that things sound great in these initial discussions and in pre-production. It's very easy to be calm and sincere and wonderful in a room with somebody when you have sort of water and food around you, and when you're on set and you've been up for 18 hours, things are very different. So for those on set, how do you keep your crew, how do you keep that sense of collaborative spirit? How do you keep people motivated and interested and inspired when it's very, very challenging? Patrick or Nick or Eric?
He's trying to figure it out right now.
Yeah, we'll keep trying to figure it out.
There's no like one way, but I think if people always feel that they're creatively involved in the project, even during production, which can tend to be a little bit sort of A plus B equals C. You're putting a plan into effect that you've already made. I think if you can keep people engaged with the fact that you are actually evolving the plan while you're making it, it keeps you active creatively, and that way you're not just functioning, you are creating. That might be a bit idealistic because it can be very difficult for sure, and sometimes you just want to get something done. But how people feel on set is extremely important, and the little things like, you know, if someone's waiting to speak to you for a question, or you're waiting to speak to someone else, that you kind of respect that and you don't just kind of dismiss it because you've got to go and move on with something else, and that you say thank you and you say please and you look people in the eye. It's as important as keeping people involved, you know.
Yeah, I think it definitely comes from the top down. I think the key creatives, how they behave and how if they're inspired on set. I mean, I think everybody takes their cue, and I think that's. I always try to remind directors. It goes back to what I said before. I try to remind directors on set that it's what we're here to do is create something and not just execute this list that we've dreamed up like 5 weeks ago. And it's difficult because of that time pressure. You know, you have 12 hours to shoot all this stuff, and you resort back to this list because it's what you fall back on. You're like, oh yeah, we talked about doing this coverage. It's like, but wait a minute, you know, like what's actually happening in front of us is so, you know, different. Like maybe we have to respond to that, and you have to remember that that's why you're there. You're not there to get the shots. You're there to actually create this thing, and it's tough because I think for people who are on set a lot, they can remove themselves from the logistics, and I try to be that person on set to say, like, this is creatively, we're here to do this. We're not here to get this list. But you know, a lot of times, if like there's just so many concerns going on, like that's like sometimes the last things people think about. You know, it's like, is the prop right? Is the hair right? Is this right? You know, and so I think like if you can stay creatively engaged and remember that that's what you're there for, then you know, people in the crew will take that cue. You know, they'll understand like, oh, this is the energy we're going for. We're not just like, you know, banging this out.
Right.
Yeah.
And allow me to pander for a moment.
Yeah.
That I rehearse with my actors beforehand, and I feel like nothing gets us back on track if we have the dramatic material right in front of us. And so you're right that a lot of it does come from the top down, but I think a lot of kind of that snap back to the soul of the film does come from the performances.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting, and I think, Nick, also what you said is very good point too, in terms of basic courtesy. Right. You know, and I think that a lot of people overlook that. I think that there's so much rushing around that happens on set sometimes, and like the note, you know, keep your ego checked at the door. There's a lot of ego that gets involved, and so and these things can sort of hurt the collaborative spirit. They can hurt the sense that people all sort of are there for, you know, a reason, a shared purpose. I mean, what are some of are there experiences, what are some of the red flags, some things that we can all sort of avoid, you know, to sort of get out of any sort of bad situations in terms of, you know, collaboration? Right, nobody wants to say anything bad, but
no, just a positive one, because I think you already hit on it. But the empowerment. If you feel empowered as a collaborator, you're gonna do more than your best because you feel you're respected, you feel you're engaged, you're part of it. And we're all in filmmaking. You're only as strong as your weakest link. Even if you have a wonderful script or a wonderful producer or a fantastic actor, you're only as good as the whole. And the whole is more than just all its parts. So it's really important to give that power, to share that power with your collaborators and make them involved. Of course, you will make the final call on something, but if you ask me, oh, why don't you give it a shot? I had something else in mind, but I'd love to see what you're thinking. I'm going to work double as hard to give you 4 options because I'm excited by that opportunity, you know, and I think it works in every department. If I have an assistant who I just tell do this, do that, versus I ask them, hey, how you feel about that, it trickles down. And ultimately, the best idea might come from the gaffer or from somebody who has nothing really officially to do in terms of creative cause, but they may still have the best idea that saves the day, which may be something simple as just putting a light somewhere or saving the prop that was the wrong prop, you know, like it could be anything. And I think if you create an atmosphere where everybody gives their best, then that's a good start.
Go ahead, Patrick.
I was going to say, there's, I think there's also something I really like about the culture of the best sets I've worked on, which is there's just everyone recognizes everyone has that day. And it's wonderful to see the people rally around people to take care of them on that day. And you take turns having that day. And I mean, that's sort of, yeah, that's the ideal. And that's when it works well. And then other times it's the opposite where it just, you actually can't resolve it in the timetable you need and without harming the film, and you need to replace people.
And how do those conversations happen? I mean, at what point do you realize that a relationship is you know, you try to inspire it and get it going, and then at some point, I'm sure there are relationships that is just not going to work. And so at that point, how do you proceed from there?
The recognition is I think what someone said before, when, you know, the film is way in the rearview mirror, and I don't know what we're spending all our energy on, but it has nothing to do with the film. And I actually find that in those situations, it tends to be a relief for the person involved. You know, they have all this buildup of all these other things that are not anything to do with the film, and they're not there to experience all this bundle of nerves. So I find that just an honest conversation about that and being ready to move on. Yeah. I think that's, you know, for an unpleasant thing that's emerged, but that happens, you know, because we take risks all the time. We give people the benefit of the doubt, but we take risks all the time. A lot of them times it works out, and sometimes it doesn't.
I love that idea of keeping that, you know, anybody might have a great idea. The gaffer may have a great, you know, you never know. And I worked on a movie when I lived in Los Angeles. It was an Eddie Murphy movie. It was like an $80 million production, and they were sort of halfway through production, and I was friends with the executive producer on the film, and every day there was a bus that would drive the crew out to set, and the executive producer had built up a rapport with the bus driver and was talking about the film and this and that, and one day the bus driver said, well, what if the movie ended a different way? And the executive producer, who's a big shot executive producer, was like, no, I can't. She was like, nobody had thought of that. That's a great idea. So she went to the producers and she tried to advocate that they change the script, and everybody loved the idea, but they couldn't quite sort of swing it because they were too deep into the production. But maybe if they'd talked to the bus driver a little bit earlier, the movie would have had a better ending.
That only happens in LA, though. And he came with his lawyer and presented a contract. Yeah.
Yeah, the bus driver was represented by CAA. Yeah. So it's an interesting point, and part of it also is in this collaborative spirit. I mean, films are, in one sense, they are made by many people. In one sense, they're made by one vision, and it's an intricate line to balance. And I recently saw 2 videos that kind of illustrate this question that I want to ask. One was of Gus Van Sant directing the movie Jerry. Beautiful movie, Casey Affleck and Matt Damon. And the behind-the-scenes footage of this movie, you would think, if you didn't know who Gus Van Sant was, that he was just a PA. He's so quiet on set. He just watches. He directs by watching. He directs by listening. He has very small private conversations with this person or that person. And he made this, you know, he's made this very beautiful movie, and this was his sort of approach. It was very, very low-key approach. And then I saw a video of Federico Fellini directing Satyricon, and he literally had a bullhorn screaming at hundreds of people, and everybody was just like, their eyes were on him, and just rapt and doing exactly what he said. And it was terrifying, but you know, that's how he directed, that's how he got his vision. So two different ways to get a vision. I mean, how do you sort of balance that of collaborating and wanting all these opinions, wanting the great idea from the gaffer and from the bus driver, but also knowing that really it's just one vision, and if the movie is many visions, it's going to be a mess? Kind of an open question.
I mean, I think for a start, I think there's a media myth of like the all-powerful creative, of like the domineering person who has this grand vision that they come up with in their hotel room or bedroom, and they kind of somehow like force it into being through, you know, pushing other people and just domineering. And the media loves that kind of story of this grand creative. And there's a few that exist, but they are like massively the exception. And then a lot of people who try to imitate them. And sometimes they succeed, which is kind of really annoying, but most of the time they fall down, if not early on, pretty quickly. And what we don't hear about, and I'm glad we're hearing more about, is actually the people who are very collaborative and who work with other people. And I think you can't really do anything that's not you. I don't think you can become a great dictator on set if that's not naturally in your being. And I think likewise, if you're not naturally a collaborator, then you probably shouldn't collaborate. You should just like go for broke and be like Fellini, and it worked for him. But I think it sounds so cheesy, but being like true to yourself and how you operate is like fundamental, because if you choose the other path, it's always going to, you know, lead you somewhere dangerous.
I might sort of divide what goes on. Like you talk about the decision making, and I might talk about some of the stages that come before that, which I think are the places where everybody can be engaged. Even if you have somebody who is very particular about how they decide, and how frequently they decide, and how often the decisions swing their way, there is the moment of observation. And I think this is something I rely on my collaborators for, and what I really love about learning to work with them is how do they hear, how do they see the world? And so there's that stage of observation that is huge. There is a stage of questioning. How do we organize this information we're getting? How do we form the question we want to answer? And then there's the deciding. And I think that, again, from the outside, it may look like the deciding is everything, but to me it feels like a lot of this that comes before, there's room for a lot of people, at the same time there's room for a big personality or a very strong particular vision.
Yeah, I want to jump on that. Because I think what excites me about collaborating too is learning, right? Like I feel like I'm going to sign on a project because I'm learning something from this director. You know, he or she may not know exactly what it is, but I feel like there's something there that I want to go on this journey with. And so I've never done a project where I thought I knew what the film was or what the shot should be. Like I'm always, if a director is reacting to something, I feel like there's something there I need to unearth and figure out how to make that better and support it. And so what's interesting actually about you mentioning Jerry is that's the first time that Gus Van Sant worked with Harris Savides, well-respected cinematographer. And Harris Savides came from a fashion background. He did huge films like American Gangster for Ridley Scott. But after he shot Jerry with Gus Van Sant, it changed the way he thought about cinema. Like he started using like no equipment, like because Jerry was like no lights. They were all in the desert. It was like barely there was barely anything. Harris Savides talks about in interviews how it really radically changed the way he saw cinema. And so all the films he did later, he did Zodiac with Dave Fincher, just the way he shot everything was influenced by that one experience. And it's because you listened to this director that he went on this journey and he revealed this thing to him that changed the way he saw his work. And I think we're all hoping for those kinds of epiphanies as we go, we collaborate with people and learn more about what we're doing.
And
yeah.
And it's also, I think it's quite normal to reach a moment where you feel stuck. I mean, talking from the post end of it, you have a cut of the film, it's nice, but it's not brilliant yet. And there comes, I don't know if I'm going ahead, but there comes a moment when it's very useful to open it up to some outside eyes. However, you have to be very careful with that, because if you take it too seriously and 3 people say, oh, you got to do this, and that's the only voice you hear, then that can be quite tragic. So how do you evaluate that feedback? And I think it's a combination of listening very carefully and then also trying to figure out what really the problem is. It's a little bit like Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, that you don't always, the problem that everybody pinpoints is not really the problem, it's an effect of the problem. So it's just being open to that science and not having panic reactions to screenings and trying to find a process how to evolve and how to really find the film ultimately.
I'm also, it reminds me of thinking of some of the most successful projects I've worked on. They tend to be groups of collaborators, so it's, for me at least, I can see that, yes, I might be dealing with the director on a one-on-one basis, but I know that the director has a good relationship with the editor, and that every question is being thought about by more than one person, so that it creates this sense of like, all right, we're not going to make any rash decisions. And if feedback comes back and it's some, maybe I try an idea, it's not necessarily working for the director. If they come back and say, you know, yeah, we'd really just like to go in another direction, I feel good about that. I feel like, okay, that's good, because I know if it's a good collaborative environment, I know that it's been given its due consideration. So if you can find those projects where somebody's nurturing a creative atmosphere, it really helps every step along the way get done as well as it possibly can.
Right. That's great. And I love that. I think we all sort of aspire to that Harry Savides moment of really learning from our collaborator. I mean, there's one sense of collaborating is great for the film. It's great for the sense of sort of crew motivation, all these things, and it's great for the movie. But it's also a great opportunity to learn. And there's so much. You know, was it Kurosawa was, you know, was late in his life, he said, you know, he was still learning how to make films, you know, the great grandmaster of filmmaking. And I think that, you know, if he's still learning at the end of his career, was learning at the end of his career, I think we all are. That's a great advantage of collaboration. I mean, one thing I want to talk about is actors also and how that fits into the collaborative spirit. I made a movie with some actors who were extremely intense. And that's why I had them in the film. I thought they'd give great performances, and I wanted their intensity to be on camera. And so the rule that I had kind of laid out was that the actors were allowed to kind of lose it on set, but the crew never was. The crew had to remain calm, and I would take the brunt of the actors' intensity because I wanted to capture that. But if the crew lost it, then it was just going to be mayhem. Then we were going to be lost. I mean, what is the collaborative spirit like with actors with you? I mean, how does that fit into this whole equation? And you being an actor also, you sort of, that's a particularly interesting perspective, I'm sure.
I love actors, and I love the casting process. And I remember one of the reasons I made the second movie is because I met so many great actors in New York, and casting the first one that I couldn't use and I couldn't work with, that I wanted to do it again. And it's my favorite actors are, and I think the ones that fit my style the best, are very intelligent, they're compassionate, and they work hard. And I feel like with that kind of combination, we can get a lot of different places. And so I look for that. I look for a real sense of movement within, you know, the first audition, maybe 10 minutes. Again, it's less important where do we start than how quickly do we get somewhere else. And I am fascinated by, I've always been fascinated with it. I've been familiar with what they do for the longest, but I continue to be very, very fascinated. And I think that that's also a question I have in filmmaking, is I think like every generation discovers what is naturalism and realism in its form, whether it's theater or film. And I feel like that's a very exciting thing to discover for the now.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's a certain kind of magic that actors wield that I'm like you. I'm always fascinated by and sort of drives my interest actually in making films. I think as actors.
And I love the last film and this film. We've worked with very young actors, and I have been so impressed with the young actors and how dedicated, how they have those same criteria and a lot of the same dedication as anyone else.
How about you, Nick? How about working with actors and collaboration with actors versus with crew? What is the dynamic like?
I mean, I think it's a very similar kind of principle, but I think just heightened in terms of sensitivity. I mean, this is my perspective, and I guess you're mainly actors, so you'll have a different point of view. But I think, you know, if you're trying to dictate what the actor is doing, naturally it's not going to work. You have to give them a place to go and then enjoy how they get there. I think, as a director, I think having a sense of craft to fall back on, I think, is really important, and knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are as a director, because if you can work with, say, a very practical way, like working on actions and working on scene needs and working on objectives, and you can also be sensitive to someone's personality and maybe bring in some of their personal life if they're comfortable with that, then you can have a sort of balance of methods and ways of working, because every actor is different. There's no one way of working with one particular actor. Some will, like, will respond very well to just very simple tasks, and some will need, like, really kind of deeper, a deeper kind of relationship. I don't know, I think actors are wonderfully surprising. I think the other thing, as a director, you kind of never want to be put off by an actor who wants to take the ball and run with it, and you have to kind of allow for that, and if you don't like it, you kind of, have to be able to shape that in a way that's sensitive. Yeah, I guess it's the same as any collaboration, but the sensitivity is heightened, because you don't want to tire someone out, you don't want to hurt someone's feeling, all these things. It's, yeah.
And what about professional actors versus non-professional actors? Right. I mean, did you? Was your film?
It was the film I made was mainly non-professional actors, and for that I feel it's really about casting. And you basically, when you're working with a non-professional actor, you have to cast someone who is essentially the person, and you work with what they bring to you. And there's not really much shaping you can do. I would never cast a non-professional in the lead role of a film, because I think the lead role has to have some kind of dramatic understanding, be able to make dramatic choices, and take the character on some kind of journey that they're aware of as a craftsperson. Whereas with a non-professional, I think it's much more about the instincts. But strangely, like, non-professionals can respond to the same kinds of language that a professional actor can work with. And yeah, I mean, there's a big difference. I think speed of response, that kind of thing, is greatly different.
Right, right.
I don't know if that answers anything, but
yeah. No, I understand. I understand. And Eric, so what have you, and being on set as the DP, I mean, you have an interesting position that you're, kind of working between the two. You're photographing the actors. You're working. You have the director in your ear, and you're kind of in between. What do you see going on? What is working well in the collaboration that you're seeing between the director and the actors?
Well, I guess I guess I could start by saying, like, my role, I feel like, as cinematographer is really to stay out of the actor's way. I feel like I need to not be present, and I'm always trying to accommodate the actor, because the last thing you want to do is tell them not to do this, because there's that's not going to catch the light. They're not going to be there. They're going to be out of frame. Like, so I try to be there during the rehearsal process, and and see what's going to evolve. And, like, there might be reminding the director of stuff we talked about, but maybe they're going to be thrown out the door because it's much better what the actor's doing there. So for me, it's always what we're trying to do is in service of the performance. So I'm never trying to bend it the other way. And in terms of, like, I mean, yeah, it's for me, it's fascinating. It's actually like one of the things that I'm most fascinated about on set is the relationship between actors and directors, because it's so varied and so different. I've worked with directors that were just very, very precise. I've also worked with directors who, gave the actors total freedom. And it's interesting, it's like balancing, and sometimes you have different types of actors on set who, some of them want that freedom and some of them want to be very directed. And it's you see kind of the director trying to negotiate all that and try to bring that scene to life. And I think that's, it's fascinating when you see them pull it off.
Right. I mean, how does all that work together? I mean, if there's a director who is giving actors a lot of freedom to move around a space as they want and improvise, but then you have other people on the crew who sort of need them to be in more specific places. Yeah. I mean, how does that? I mean, that's a place where some of the collaboration might start you know, kind of butting heads a little bit.
Yeah,
how's that dealt with?
It's interesting. I mean, there's, you know, obviously lots of different types of actors. But I found like the more professional, seasoned actors are kind of aware of the mechanical limitations of what they need to do. I mean, they'll actually turn to me during rehearsal, like, well, can I do this, or is that going to screw you? But if it's kind of a more free-form process, I find myself kind of editing the blocking and asking the director, like, well, can they do this instead of that, and then we don't have to like cover it 3 different ways. You know, like I'm trying to shape the scene without imposing too much, but you know, you have to find that limit of like how much you can actually do, but still allow the performance to be what it is. If there's something like harmless, it's like, oh, they don't need, is it okay if they don't go all the way to the other side of the room for that hat? Can I put it here? And if everyone's okay, that's great. It'll solve, you know, save us a shot. It'll save us, you know, a certain kind of blocking or something. So, you know, that comes to the relationship you establish in pre-production, definitely, you know, like how much the director is willing to have you kind of speak up. You know, I've been on sets where actors may have been resistant to the director's notes, and you know, then the director doesn't want to hear that on set because he's just trying to manage the personalities and have this thing like be successful and not like fall apart. So like I'm not going to sit there and, well, you know, that could be much better if they, you know, come in and do this instead. So you know, you have to be really aware of kind of what's happening in front of you before you know, put yourself in a situation. Yeah.
Can I ask the DP a question?
Yes.
If the director says to you, like obviously not in front of everybody, but aside, you know, what do you think of the performance? Like, how honest are you?
Oh yeah, if it's the two of us, because the
it sounds like a stupid question, no, but I mean, it's you can't just say I think it sucks, or you can't just say. Right. You could say I think it's amazing. That's fine, but how? No. Where do you?
It always goes back to pre-production, because during the shot listing, we're talking about, you know, the emotional life of the journey of these actors, and it's like if they're asking me that, I'm trying to tie it to that. I mean, my personal taste is kind of irrelevant because it's the director's taste, but I am saying like, well, I don't feel like we're getting this. You know, like, do we have that moment where they're becoming this, or doing this, or changing this, or feeling this on set? And you know, there'll be times. I mean, it'll always be conversation in private, but I'll pull the director apart in a scene, aside in a scene, and be like, not apart, wrong word. I'll pull him or her aside and say, you know, yeah, like, do we, you know, we talked about like this scene really being about this. Do we see that? I mean, did we get it? Like, I don't know if we did. And it's interesting because a lot of times, you know, as a cinematographer, and I operate my own the camera, like sometimes it's just me and the actor in the room, you know, and I'm kind of responding to what's happening in front of me and saying like, well, you know, then I'll go back to the director who might be at the monitor and say, well, yeah, you know, like, I don't know if we got that. Like, maybe, you know, do we need to push that more? But it goes back to the creative, you know, conversations we had before, and for me, that's what pre-production is about, is like finding out what scenes are about, you know, emotionally, subjectively, and all that sort of thing. And so it's based on conversations we've had. Yeah, but I mean, you know, I try to be as honest as possible, but you know, a lot of directors don't take criticism well.
They don't take it well?
Don't take criticism well.
Yeah. I mean, what's the best way to do that? I mean, this is actually a really important point, because there's going to be, I mean, more things, well, I'm not going to say that there's a great opportunity for things to go wrong on set. Yeah. And it's very hard to make things go right. When they do, it's magical. And so how do you make those corrections? If you have a suggestion, if you're you know, when you're editing, when you're looking at the footage, I mean, how do you have those conversations with people in a way that's productive, that keeps people motivated and interested, but doesn't crush their spirit, but is honest?
Diplomacy is key.
Yeah. Diplomacy.
Yes, but also these days, I mean, most of the time, the director and the producer will have dailies on set even, or very early on. So it's not that we have to wait a week till we see our dailies anymore. So it's not usually coming completely out of the blue if we find out a performance is slightly uneven, or there are maybe even severe problems with somebody's interpretation of a character. Usually I'm not the only one saying, you know, so and oftentimes, and this is not just about the actor, this also affects other issues. It's helpful to just cut together a version really quick. I had that on my last project, where the director was concerned because we had done a 4-minute Steadicam shot, which was the only coverage of the scene. And while the DP is amazing, we were concerned, well, do we really have it? Because we have nothing to cut to if we don't. Or yes, we could maybe cheat something, but it was really difficult to combine different takes of it. And so the director asked me to cut together a version, or actually a couple of versions with different takes. There was some cutting involved, so one take is what was there to cut, right? But so that was helpful to just quickly do that and look at it together and then evaluate it and get a couple of eyes at it, producer, cinematographer, and say, okay, we're good. Do we need to do any pickups or not?
Right.
Again, the advantage of having an editor on board is you can do that while you're shooting and not when everything is gone already.
Right, right. I mean, Max, how does it go for you in post-production? How do you have those sort of difficult conversations if you feel like choices are sort of leaning one way and you think it should go another?
Diplomacy really is key, and also just, you know, I guess it's sort of the same way you would have any kind of debate, I won't say argument, but debate with anybody about anything. The best way to approach it is to be reasoned in your arguments, sort of try to say, well, the reason that I was taking this approach was because based on our discussions about the film and our intent and where we said we were heading, my professional opinion says this is the way to get to that spot, but I may be missing something. You know, you always have to be willing to accept that you may be the one, you know, me, the composer, I may be, you know, misinterpreting something. So I try to always keep that idea open, that it's a dialogue back and forth. And I think if you as the collaborator do that, you can hopefully encourage that behavior in the people you're collaborating with. If it gets to the point where where it feels like you're just not seeing eye to eye, sometimes it's best. The nice thing is I can jump around in a film. I can say, all right, let's leave that cue aside for a week. I'm going to go work on something else. Let's see if we can get that working. And frequently just the space for both people to take a little space from an idea. You come back, and even then, even it may still not be working, but then you may have a different way of talking about it, you know.
That's a great idea. I mean, that's a great note. It's a little bit of space is a great thing.
It's the luxury that we have in post.
Right, you don't always have on set.
You guys don't have on set. So.
Yeah.
There's no
Patrick,
space.
how do you give notes? Because you're coming at it as a writer, as a director, and as an actor. How are you giving then notes if things aren't going right? If you need sort of things to go a different way, since you are wearing so many hats.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It takes a little time. And then I think it's, you know, in kind of the diplomacy that people have been talking about, sometimes it's, you need to rely on the other thing, which is that you've banked some goodwill so that you can come across brash sometimes in your lesser moment, and people will forgive you, and they will work with you. I remember this one time, the last film we shot on Super 16, and it was a tiny crew, and so the DP was loading every magazine himself. And there was this one day we ran out. And there was this last shot, it was a oneer, and he had moved the camera a certain way, and I was unhappy about that, and I asked him to reload. And so we all sat around for 20 minutes while he reloaded, and he was so furious with me. He told me afterwards he was so furious. Afterwards, he realized that I was going again because of performance. But he was so furious, but in that moment, he did it.
Right.
He would go along, and he gave me kind of like we were talking about when people have their bad day, when people have their intense moment.
Yeah.
He kind of gave me that. And so I'm grateful for collaborators like that.
Right.
Well, they don't negotiate it very well.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point, and that kind of patience of that somebody would have to kind of swallow that moment when you're unhappy to do something, but you know you've got to do it. It's just sort of the proper thing to do, and you do it anyway. That's, I think, a sign of a great collaborator, somebody who's got that kind of resolve and patience to be willing to do that. And then maybe have the conversation later at the end of the day, kind of in private, and just sort of talk about it then.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do know that when conflict does arise, or it doesn't even need to be a conflict, it could just be a difference of opinion. I do find that it's great to, if you take a little break, or if you maybe a decision is made, no, we're going to go in this direction, to then be able to talk to somebody after the fact and just sort of like, I guess, you know, don't go to bed angry kind of attitude, you know, because then you can feel that's just going to help build the strength of the collaborative relationship that you are going to have the next day. You know, if you feel like I was heard, you heard, you know, what I was thinking, I heard what you were thinking. We decide something that I didn't quite agree with, but now I understand why and where that came from. And you can feel a little bit better about it when the next argument happens, that you're going to get over that hump.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult when these things happen in public, in the crew, with everybody around. I mean, that's sort of a situation that you want to avoid. With tempers flaring, that kind of thing. That's challenging. I want to hear from everybody, sort of inspire us. Tell us your best or a great moment of collaboration or a collaborator you've worked with, and sort of what worked really well. Like, what's just one of those really glowing moments that you've had? Anybody can pipe in, but I'd like to hear from everybody. And then we'll go to some questions from the audience.
The first thing, I guess I'll start. The first thing that comes to my mind is I did a film called The King, which starred Gael Garcia Bernal and William Hurt, and it was a wonderful film. I was very, very lucky to be involved with it, and the reason I was involved with it was they had a long tracking shot. It was a 4 minutes. The end of the film is like 4 or 5 minutes of straight one shot. No talking, no dialogue, nothing. And they were actually a little bit stuck. They didn't know what to do with this scene. They couldn't get music that was working right. So they asked a bunch of composers to try to help. And that's one of those situations where you, as a creative collaborator, you want to have the freedom to say, like, yeah, I'll be happy to throw my 2 cents in. It's okay if it doesn't work out, but I'm going to give it my all. And so I ended up doing a piece that was sort of more along the line of what you would traditionally expect. And the director is James Marsh. He heard the piece that I did originally, and he was kind enough to come back and say, you know, I like aspects of this, but I really want you to sort of push it. Try something entirely different, because we can't go with anything that's normal. And it was only by doing that I was able to come up with this entirely weird piece of music that it literally, you know, changed the whole film, and it changed the way that the film was then scored throughout. Then they hired me to do the project because of that. But it's interesting, because I always remind myself that you have to listen to your collaborators, because frequently they're giving you the material that you need to make good stuff. You know, you can't do it on your own. Right. You would, because you end up making you fall back on what you're familiar with, and then you find yourself in a rut. So finding those moments where you can have somebody say, oh, you know, try it this way, you know, stretch a little bit is always good. So look for those moments.
That's great.
I don't know how inspiring this will be, but this inspires me. I love my collaborators as an audience. And I remember there was this one shot, it was kind of the emotional climax of a scene, of the film. And I'm a very particular director, and so we had really, really sketched out for the whole film, you know, the particular way we were going to shoot it. And we were shooting a very small space. And I wanted to be in the room for rehearsal. I just feel it's very different when you're not in the room. So I wanted to be in the room, but I couldn't. I had to stay out of the way, and so there were some apple boxes in the corner. I just stood on the apple boxes and watched rehearsal. And we ended up shooting from there. We scrapped the coverage we had, and we just shot the whole thing from up there. And I have odd ideas from time, and there are big departures. And what I really rely on my DP in that case to be the audience. He'll give me this, there'll be this moment of silence while he's changing gears. And then my favorite thing is when he just turns around and starts barking out orders about how, okay, this is what we need to do to reconfigure. He's been my audience, and I know he approves. And everybody's different. Like, the editor I work with, every so often I'll say, I have a crazy idea, and I'll tell him what it is, and then I'll walk away. And I'll listen. And if he starts laughing, I know it works. And so those are my favorite things, when these things that surprise you, even though I'm a planner, they surprise you, how the people I'm working with will help me figure out if this departure is insane, or if it's actually we're onto something.
That's great. Love that.
Comedy is so rewarding, right? I have so many moments. I just, in terms of a really positive moment, would be I did a musical for the first time last year with Richard LaGravenese, who's done many films and is a writer also. And he took a complete chance on me. We had never collaborated before, and just based on our conversations about the script, and when I had to show him a first cut of a long sequence, because the film is structured in songs, it was very nerve-wracking for me, because I had, there was nothing said really, and I had to go on the performances of the actors and the little conversation we had before. And when he and the DP, he came into the editing room and opened it up to his DP and his assistant, so there was always a nice group energy. Saw the first version, they laughed and they cried, and it was this wonderful feeling of, wow, we got something here. So if that moment, if you feel like, yes, this is working, there's something to go for, right, that's the most rewarding you can have. And obviously that's not always the case in the first assembly, but to ultimately get to that with pushing and doing whatever you can is very rewarding.
Right.
I think it's nice when you kind of have a sense of what someone's like and you have a kind of faith in them, and then they prove that they really are that kind of person. They kind of jump out in the moment. And just to give a sort of short example of that, I had a connection with that with an actor who I worked with in Bolivia, and we were shooting in a very small village in the middle of nowhere with hardly any people in, and we didn't have a particular location, which was like a small cottage with an opening window. And the line producer said, oh, we don't have this location yet, and it's like midday. I'm like, yeah, no, please, can you try and find it? And like day goes on, yeah, we still haven't found it. We need to find someone who's here and who can let us into their house. And I said, well, there's this kind of schoolroom here. Can we not use this? He's like, well, no, there's nobody here. The caretaker is around, but he's blind, so we can't find him. And he doesn't know where he is. And so the day goes on. I said, well, have we got this location yet? And he said, no, we don't have it. And I said, okay, well, what do we do? He goes, well, I think we just have to go back. I'm like, no, we can't do that. We've got to shoot the rest of this film, and this scene's really the most important scene in the entire film, when these two characters fall in love through this window. And his answer was, no, we can't do it. And so the actor who I'd been working with, who was kind of like, a lot of creative force was around him. He barely did anything. He's a great, great actor. And I thought, if I tell him what's going on, I have a feeling of what he's going to do about this schoolroom and about this window and the way it's all locked up. And I said to him, so our producer's saying we've got to stop now because we can't find this location. It looks a bit like that schoolroom over there, but that schoolroom's locked up and the blind caretaker isn't anywhere to be found. Either we shut down or, I don't know, what do we do? And he's like, oh, I know what to do. And I see him walk off. He kind of jerries the door and picks the lock, opens it. And then suddenly this window opens and he pops up and climbs out. And it's like, excellent, yes. Yeah, I knew it. I knew you were the best person to cast for this film, and that's and strangely that we actually realized suddenly that one of the rental cars had to be returned to the city 500 miles away, and lo and behold, the guy who did that was the line producer who was trying to shut down the day. So we kind of engineered his exit from the set. A couple of days later, and meanwhile we got what turned out to be a really good scene. So that's. You have faith in people, and they prove, and then,
That reminds me very briefly that Werner Herzog has a film school, and a couple of the things that he teaches at the film school is how to hotwire a car, how to milk a cow. These are things that he says you will need to know how to do on a film set. Eric?
I guess I feel like what's always disheartening for me on set is when I watch ideas that we talked about die in front of us. This story is about one that lived and continued. So I shot William H. Macy's directorial debut last year called Rudderless. That was at Sundance this year. And one thing we talked about in pre-production was always that the camera would sustain the whole scene. We would never set up for just like portions of the scene. Like we had to allow the performance to unfold entirely through the shots. So no matter what coverage we got, whether it was a close-up or a medium, like we would try to design it so it carried the entire scene. And he had a real talent for blocking, which was amazing. Like he really knew how to move actors in space and give them activities. So there was one scene one day, it was like our last shot for the day, and we were running out of time, blah, blah, blah. And like, basically, the film stars Billy Crudup and Anton Yelchin, and they're like about to start band practice in his garage, and then like these guys pull up in the outside, and there's like a little bit of dialogue, then they have to go outside and more dialogue, and then they bring the equipment in, and we're sitting there blocking the scene, and you know, we were just talking about the angles, and it felt like to me it was like, oh man, we're gonna have to cover this like with 3 shots, and we don't have time. The sun's going down. Like I don't know. And he just turned to me. He's like, why, you know, can't we do it in a oneer? And I was like, oh, yeah, maybe. And so we tried it, and it was like a steady cam shot, a single shot, back and forth. It was fantastic. But I think I fell in love with him when he turned to me and said that. I was like, yes, that's what we talked about. We should do that. So it's amazing, you know, when it gets upheld, even when everybody else is like, oh man, it's, you know, we're gonna have to cut it up. We're gonna have to come back to do coverage, but yeah. So that was inspiring.
You know, and it's interesting too that sometimes that's actually another benefit of collaboration too, is that sometimes it brings you back to your original idea, which I know that we've touched on a little bit too, but I can't sort of, you know, it's an important note to have, because it's happened to me personally a bunch of times that you do get lost sometimes along the way of production, and so the people around you will bring you back. This is what we wanted to do. This was the idea. This was the feeling. So a couple of questions from the audience here. Okay, pretend you're new to this business and you don't have any contacts. You have a script and $10,000. Please go through the steps, finding people, contracts. It's a good question. It's a good practical question. Find your collaborators to get your movie made. How do you do that? What's sort of the basic 1, 2, 3 steps of this?
Craigslist, obviously. Facebook.
So how do you go about finding, if you don't have the contacts, how do you go about finding people to collaborate with? Craigslist? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think
there's actually been, I know people who have found good people on Craigslist.
I think it's about using this sort of 6 degrees of separation thing. It's like maybe you don't know anyone directly, but you might know someone who runs a bar, which happens to be near a theater, so he might be able to, you know, so it's about looking at the people that you already know and trying to work out who they might know. I think that's certainly one thing. If it's finding a producer, which it sounds like this is where you are, you can maybe look at like a film school kind of thesis screening kind of thing, and look at who the producers are, people who are hungry, who are willing to sit down and take on a new project. I think there are various like labs and other forms of workshops whereby you can get a sense of who people are and approach them in a sort of easier kind of way. Yeah, I think so, using people to get to people, but then also there are sort of local resources that don't just involve cold calling people, whereby you can have a chance to establish a relationship with someone before you press play and go with them.
Yeah, I was just reminded, I think it's another potential avenue you can take is you can be one of the people answering, like you can find collaborators for future projects for yourself by working on, you know, by giving yourself to somebody now on their project. Because I know for me, I started out by doing, you know, sort of small things, fixes. You know, we need 3 cues in this film, and the composer that we originally hired isn't on it, and all of a sudden you sort of get pulled in, and you meet new people, and then you've got this whole new network that you can then tap to get things done. You have to be patient sometimes. It takes a long time sometimes, but if you stick with it, it'll work.
There's a question regarding the composer. How much is budget put into the conversation regarding, you know, one instrument or full orchestra, like sort of being aware of the budget? I mean, where's that conversation?
It all depends on the film and what kind of film. I do a lot of documentaries. I do narrative features. They all have various different budgets. And these days, things have changed dramatically from the music point of view in the past 10 years or so, as you've probably noticed too. Like, you know, 10 years ago, I would get called once the picture was locked. Like, I would never get a call before the picture, maybe at like a fine cut. And these days, it's much more common to bring a composer in earlier, which is, as you were saying, is actually nice. It's nice for us too. But budget-wise, you kind of have to go on a project-by-project basis. And the old rule of thumb was, I think it was like 10% of the full budget of the production would be dedicated to music. But these days, there's so many options that you can take. I know I'm doing a lot of films now where it's a combination of licensed material that I've already written for other films or just from records that then I'll get hired to add a few original pieces. That's, you know, a way you can sort of massage a budget to fit what the requirements are. 'Cause the reality is everybody's doing different kind of projects these days, and you can't really predict, you know, how much money you're going to need. Paying for an orchestra is generally always tough, so I advise getting away from that unless you've got the funds. But even that, you know, you can get a couple of violinists and some decent samples and fake it pretty well these days. So.
And keep in mind, magic is possible, because I worked on a film about 2 years ago, which was a super low budget. It was actually a writer-director's debut, and he had shot it over several years with different editors and different segments. And we were coming into the final round where we had a last chance for pickups in that very week, but we hadn't really gotten to the finishing of the cut yet. And by chance, I had some temp cues from a composer I had met at a festival that we thought we could never get. I mean, he's way too big. He's amazing, you know. And I just knew another colleague had been working with him, and I got his email, and I just asked him, hey, would you be willing to take a look at this? And because he liked the director, and they totally hit it off, he ended up scoring the film for what probably was way below his budget, but they had a lot of fun. They recorded an album out of it. It had other benefits and other implications. So you never know.
It's so much about the relationship, because it is, at least for me, the reason I do film composing as opposed to just doing songwriting and making records is it's a totally unique way of collaborating. You get to create things that would never have existed in any other way. If you find the right person, if you get a call from somebody and they happen to have heard something that you've done previously and they're excited about that, and then they show you the script or they show you the fine cut or whatever, and then if it sparks something in my mind, it's much more likely that I'll drop the budget to make it work. I'll come up with some way to make it happen, right. Because that's why we do this. That's why we're all creative people instead of accountants. You know, right. Not that there's anything wrong with accountants.
No, I agree. There's a love of what we do that you make sacrifices for. Absolutely. There are two more good questions I wanted to go through, and then we'll wrap it up. If the director is not the writer, as a director, do you collaborate with the writer in pre-production and production? What is that conversation like? I mean, I think we have director-writers here, but any experience sort of, outside of that, or what you've seen? No
experience outside of that.
I mean, I'm collaborating with the director at the moment as a writer, so... and I've sort of done it the other way around. I think there's two things. Can you remind me the questions from a writer or from a director?
From a director's perspective, right. Are you having a collaborative experience with the writer? What is it like in pre-production versus what is it like in production? Are you still working with the writer during production?
I think ideally there's a kind of a handoff, and that doesn't mean that you suddenly rip the project away from the writer, but it means at some point the director has to kind of take ownership of the material. And you've got to say, this is the story that I want to tell, and this is how I'm going to do it, and I'm going to stand there and be responsible for that. And the writer should be servicing that kind of that kind of outcome. I think as a director, if you don't reach the point where you're kind of saying this is my story as much as it is the writer's story, then you're always going to be looking to I don't know. It's got to satisfy you in order to make it, and so that handoff does have to happen. And I think working as a writer for a director, you have to kind of make that possible. And if they're seeing a scene as not working for them, there's no way they're ever going to be able to direct it in a way that's satisfying for the audience if you don't sit down to address what it is that they want to bring out of that scene. And it may be that they haven't touched on something that you had as an idea, so you might need to illuminate more to them what it was that you were thinking, and it's a question then of communication and expressing something. And likewise, as a director, looking to a writer to understand the scene, you can say, I don't like the scene, I'm going to do it my way, or you can say, what is it you're trying to do with the scene, and you can work out what the original tension was and how that's coming across in the action, behavior, dialogue, and then maybe shape that to take it more in the way that you think it can work and be. So, yeah, I think that process of handing off is kind of what you're aiming for and gunning for, but in a way that the director feels they can take ownership for it, and the writer feels, okay, cool, he understands the material that I've written, and for the bits that I didn't do very well, they've kind of helped us get to a better place, and now they're really going to do an amazing job with every scene. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah.
However, most TV shows work quite differently, right? Where the writers are the show creators, and the directors just get hired for an episode, have 4 days to edit it, and then bye-bye, you know?
Exactly.
So there's very different scenarios of that collaboration that, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. What are the potential incentives to help in finding crew collaborators for a low-budget project? How much does each position typically get paid? It's a good practical question also. I mean, how do you get people involved if you don't have the budget to pay everybody? I mean, you were talking about interesting incentives. Sometimes you'll sort of feel that you'll want to get involved with the project even if the budget isn't quite there. I mean, what are ways to sort of get people together?
I think one way that I found for this last film to balance that, because it was a very low-budget film, and for me, we shot in 2 weeks, and it's a very different commitment to say people, you know, I need you for 2 weeks of production versus I need you for even 3 weeks.
Huh. Interesting.
You know, that 2 weeks, we're not really responsible for your mortgage that month or your rent, you know? It's like, and as far as pay, I mean, that'll vary a lot. I mean, it's pretty much similar to what SAG is used to getting paid, you know, on the low budget films. And we try, sort of the trade-off is one, to be, you know, to tend to the thing that brought you here. You know, to the reason you're here, we will take care of that. And that's how, one way we'll repay your goodwill. The other is to be fair. At our level of contracting and everything else, it's not about what's in the contract. And it's basically about being fair, giving, sometimes that means you give people things they don't ask for or that aren't in their contract, just because that's fair across how people are working.
Right.
And so I think that those kinds of parameters, help set up these projects so that for the same reason, you know, actors come on board, I think the crew will come on board.
Right, right. Great. Is there anything else? Anybody? Well, thank you for everybody for coming. Round of applause for the panel.